All right, hey guys, it's Andrew, and today I wanted to make a video about saturated fats. Now, you've probably heard in your lifetime that saturated fats are bad, and that we instead should be eating things like vegetable oils in replace of that, right? And I wanted to look into this myself. I had a few questions. This is going to be a long video because there's a lot to get into. But we're going to look at, where did the idea that saturated fats are bad come from? What started it? And then we'll get into why it's still around today, honestly. There's some pretty mind blowing things that may not be a shocker at the same time, when we get into them. But I kind of divided this board up in half here. This top half is going to be what started hate on saturated fat. And then this bottom half is going to be what keeps it alive today, that hate. Why do we hate this so much? And I've got my laptop here. I actually used AI to help me dive into this because I read a research article and like an actual research, PubMed article that talked about all these things. And I was just mind blown. And I wanted to look into all of these things deeply. And then I was like, you know what, I'm going to use AI. So I've got my computer here just for notes and stuff. So up here on this top half, we've got kind of this triangle relationship here. And it starts off with a guy named Ancel. And he's a physiologist. You can do your own research on him. There's a lot of information out there about him that people have talked about him before. He's really famous for his 7 countries study, and that's kind of what got him into the nutrition field. So again, he's not a nutritionist, he's just a physiologist. And he worked in a study, the Minnesota starvation study after World War II, I believe. Anyways, this is the guy. And he had a hypothesis that saturated fats were bad. And his hypothesis later gets coined the diet heart hypothesis. If I can even remember that right. The diet heart hypothesis, basically meaning saturated fats are bad, and that we should eat polyunsaturated fats. So his 7 countries study, see if my notes have it here. He did that study in the 1950s. And it's a pretty controversial study because he picked countries, he was looking at countries that ate high amounts of saturated fats and who had, higher mortality rates essentially, or heart attacks and cardiovascular disease. And out of all the countries, imagine this, he only picks 7 out of, I think there was at least 22 countries of data available. And one controversial thing about this study is that people argue that he cherry-picked the data that he uses, and he only picked studies that proved his hypothesis. He specifically left out countries like France, who eat a lot of saturated fats, but they weren't dying, they were healthy. So, it's pretty controversial. Important to note, right, that this guy is avoiding data that doesn't prove his hypothesis. But now we'll get into the AHA, the American Heart Association, and P&G, Procter and Gamble. And I guess we'll start with P&G first, because they're the makers of Crisco, or were. I think that company's a different company now or whatever, but Procter and Gamble made Crisco and were pushing it in the early 1900s, okay? So this is even before World War I. This is a long time ago. And in 1948, Procter and Gamble give the American Heart Association $1.7 million, which in today's money is about $20 million. And that's a lot of money. The association was pretty small and kind of not seen as legit. I don't want to say not seen as legit, but they were very small until they got this money from Procter and Gamble. Then that really boosted them into a big organization. And that's way before Ancel Keys gets involved here. So essentially saying the American Heart Association was backed by Procter and Gamble, who make Crisco oil, made of polyunsaturated fats or vegetable oil. So, that's money a lot, and that's important to note here. And then 1961 is when Ancel Keys essentially joins the American Heart Association. He gets on their board with their nutritionist, and they all decide that saturated fats are bad and that we should eat polyunsaturated fats. So that's where this hate for saturated fat basically all comes from. It's this little triangle relationship between Ancel Keys, the American Heart Association, Procter and Gamble. That's basically where it came from. Now, let's get into some crazier stuff here. Because what's keeping this going? Because this happened in 1961, essentially. And it's been going since. So we're going to come down here to the DGA, which is the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. It's an organization. And it's co-owned by the USDA and Human Health Services. And their mission basically support healthy eating for Americans. I mean, it's what replaced the My Pyramid that we all grew up with and loved, right? And before they were the DGA, in 1977, I'm reading this here off my notes, they started this less than 10% recommendation. So saturated fats, they said, should be limited to less than 10% of your total caloric intake. That was kicked off in 1977, it's a long time ago. Spearheaded by a person in this, it doesn't say if this is not a senator. Anyways, it was pushed by some guy named Nick Morton, who's not a scientist, under Senator George McGovern. They levied heavily on Ancel Keys' diet heart hypothesis, and that's how in the Senate they kind of got this approved to say to all Americans, eat less than 10% of saturated fat. So, and then the DGA got formed whenever, I think in the 1980s, and they've kept this recommendation since. That's what I'm trying to say here. Well, things heat up here and get spicy. So, from my research here, it's saying that a pile of studies since the 2000s, these are meta-analyses, which take a bunch of studies, especially randomized controlled studies, and compile them all together into one big study. So it's a study that looks at hundreds, hopefully at least hundreds, but a lot of different studies, okay? And it's pretty much the strongest base of evidence that we have. And these meta-analyses found no clear link between saturated fat intake and cardiovascular mortality. So why is this recommendation still around then, essentially? And so I'm going to skip down here in my notes. This is some crazy stuff. So the DGA has a committee, and every 5 years they get together and review and revise the actual guidelines that they come out with every 5 years. So they look at new science, they revise, they decide what to keep, what not to keep. And there's quite a bit of stories of certain people and scientists bringing forth evidence to these certain members of these committees, evidence that show saturated fats don't actually cause mortality. They're not as bad as we think they are. And these committee members essentially just ignore them. They didn't even look at it. They're like, I don't care. I'm trying to see right here in my notes. Yeah, these committees they didn't care. There's been lots of independent reviews done that basically disprove this 10% recommendation. It's been brought forth to the Dietary Guidelines for Americans Committee multiple times. They've ignored it. Now, if that's hard to believe, imagine this. Within members of the DGA, there's a lot of conflicts of interest as well. I'm just going to go ahead and read some of these out. So let's see, the 2015 Dietary Guidelines Committee caught flack for members with industry links. One member got funding from the California Walnut Commission and Unilever Company, which they make margarine, their seed oil company. Another member got money from Luminary, tied to General Mills and PepsiCo, more grain in seed oil. The 2020 Dietary Guideline Committee was even worse. Apparently there's a saturated fat subcommittee that included experts with deep ties to plant-based advocacy and industries like soy and tree nuts that thrive when saturated fats get trashed on, right? One member had spent 50 years proving the diet heart hypothesis that Ancel came up with. Another member pushed plant-based diets for religious reasons. These aren't small potatoes, is what the AI is telling me. FOIA docs from a research article show these conflicts within these members were not disclosed and show bias towards PUFAs, or aka seed oils. So that's pretty crazy, that there's some members within this organization who are essentially bought or have ties. Crazy, no. There's even more, though, about some of these members on the dietary guidelines. This is a lot of notes. There were some emails between some higher upper people in the DGA. Some emails back and forth, within the committee members, admitting in the emails that this 10% cap was basically made up. AI tracked it down, and it says in FOIA, I should have looked what that is. I'm not sure what FOIA is, but FOIA released emails from the 2015 Dietary Guideline Committee. Says that a committee member flat out said there was no scientific justification for a specific numeric cap on saturated fat. Another email thread showed them wrestling with the 10% limit, admitting it was inherited from older guidelines, not derived from fresh evidence. They kept it anyways, likely to avoid rocking the boat with the American Heart Association and the USDA, who have tons of policies built around this 10% cap. So they get caught in even exchanging emails saying that this recommendation is not, this number at least, right, is not like really scientifically backed. Yet they keep going with it. So that's the DGA. that's just one thing. All that information we just went over is just one thing. Okay, there's a whole lot more notes on here. I'm trying to get to these studies. So it's pretty interesting. There are old trials from like 1970s, 1980s that essentially disprove this hypothesis that saturated fats are bad. And then there's even been new studies, new science here that's done the same thing. And for lots of reasons that we'll get into, they just keep getting ignored by everybody. So old trials. There's a Minnesota coronary experiment from 1968 through 73, which actually, believe it or not, was done by Ancel. And I don't think I have notes about this one. I'm sorry, this study is insane. Oh, here we go. I think I found it. Maybe. Where is it? I just read this. This Minnesota study, led by Ancel Keys. It was a double-blind, randomized, controlled experiment. Let's see, they swapped saturated fat for corn oil, or half for corn oil. And what they found is cholesterol dropped, but mortality rose. Now, so that, it didn't prove that saturated fat, raised mortality. Actually, the corn oil did, but cutting out saturated fat lowers your cholesterol. So here's the crazy thing about this. I don't see it on my notes here. Okay. So the results of this study, led by Ancel Keys. So again, they find out if you swap saturated fat for corn oil, cholesterol levels go down, but mortality risk goes up, right? They don't publish, first of all, it's years before they publish any of this data. And they only publish some of the data. And guess which parts they publish? They publish the parts of the data of, replacing saturated fat with corn oil lowers cholesterol, essentially. It wasn't until 2016 that they actually published the rest of this study, done in 1968 through 73. It's not until 2016 that the rest of this study gets published and we actually find out that, they found the opposite of what they were hoping to be true. The fact that, you delay something like that for so long is such a red flag. It still blows my mind that happened. How is that possible? I can't believe that. It blows my mind. Then there's this other study called the Sydney Diet Heart Study from 1966 through 73 as well. Randomized. They've got saturated fat where they swap for safflower oil. This study was not published until 2013. Holy smokes. I can't even do math that quick. That's like 40 years later. In this study, cholesterol fell more in the safflower group, not surprising, but deaths spiked, all cause, and cardiovascular deaths, heart disease went up. And then a meta-analysis with this study involved showed no benefit from polyunsaturated being swapped being swapped in for saturated fats. So that's just old trials. Trying to find with some of these new trials, because these are like the big ones, that absolutely disprove. Let's see. That's just more on the committee. Most of this new science is a lot of researchers researching, doing review articles of newer trials on saturated fat effects, but also revisiting these old trials is what this newer science is. So people reviewing older science and going, hang on, like this actually is not what we think it is back then. So systematic reviews, let's see, 2022 PubMed paper found, that's the subcommittee one, my bad. Over 20 meta-analyses, which is a ton, and reviews since 2010. One of these famous researchers is Suri Torino. These meta-analyses and reviews showed no clear link between saturated fat and heart disease or total mortality. And then it just goes on to say, yet the DGA continues to hold the line for this recommendation, and basically, still saying saturated fat's bad. So there you go. This is, let me make sure I didn't pass on anything else. This stuff blew my mind. This is too good to be true. You know what I mean? This absolutely blew my mind. So don't even ask why I was looking into this anyways in the first place. So there you go. 1961, around that time, saturated fat comes out as being bad from the American Heart Association, backed by Ancel Keys, and a lot of money from Procter & Gamble. Excuse me. That's what gets started. And then you've got the DGA that continues to keep that tradition alive, essentially. And the DGA continues to ignore old trials that showed otherwise. They ignore new science, and reviews, and they're just doubling, tripling down on what they think to be true. And there's a lot of controversy with members within this committee, right, who are basically bought and have other motives that are questionable, right? So overall, I guess I will, why not kind of share what led me to this that blows my mind, is in school, especially like my nutrition classes that I took, because I love nutrition, we talked about dietary guidelines a lot, like a ton. A lot of information that we learn comes from here. And it's, presented as in we can trust this, right? And I'm sure someone in my class, I don't know if it was me or not, someone I'm sure asked a question about this number in a sense. It's like, how do we know where 10% came from? That's a pretty nice, even number, right? What kind of studies do you have to do to figure out a percentage like that, versus grams or something? I don't know. And I'm sure if that question was asked, whoever the teacher was, that I had, they probably would say something like, oh, that's a good question. I don't know, but I do know that this number is scientifically backed by evidence, right? Which is that's a fair answer. If especially since they don't know. And then as a student, you stop there. You're like, oh, okay, cool. And I still kind of thinking, like, how did I get down this rabbit hole here? I was looking into PUFAs, that's why. And PUFAs, polyunsaturated fatty acids, I'll make a video about this another day. These are pretty bad for you. And these in my nutrition classes were also hammered home as like healthy. Eat these all the time. I was looking into that, and then I think I got into here and I was like, holy smokes. And so that's what blows my mind, right? Is being taught in school, given not a very good answer for why this exists. And then I didn't look further into it. It's like, well, if this is scientifically backed, let's look into it, right? Why not? Let's see where it comes from. And I mean, you got a lot going on, and there's a lot more that I'm sure I haven't talked about either. But there you go. The whole point of this is not to, I don't know, sound like a conspiracy theorist. I hate that word. But these facts and details of everything is just too convenient, right? It's too much of a coincidence that I just can't believe this hate on saturated fat still exists today. I forgot to mention there, oh, my computer shut off, dang it. There was, I can't remember the year, it was pretty recent. I want to say it was in the 2020s, but over 600 doctors and I think it was 56 members in Congress, tried to push to change this recommendation with all the information that I presented here, and it didn't get through. So you've got all this science contradicting weak, shaky science, cherry picked data, for crying out loud. That's just all a little too convenient. So this isn't a love post for saturated fats. I'm not saying eat as much as you can all the time, right? And completely avoid PUFAs. It's not exactly what I'm saying. But I am saying, when you're hearing things like this, you kind of need to look into who's telling you to not eat this, to not do this or to do that. And you got to follow the money, right? Who's behind telling you that? Do they actually have your best interests in heart or not? Because in my opinion, there's this other crazy statistic I forgot to mention, that the grain in seed oil, maybe it's just grains, like industry companies, they lobbied, and I'm trying to remember what year this happened. It was recent as well. They lobbied like $130 million to Congress. Okay. The meat, animal product, essentially industry, only lobbied 80 million. That's a pretty big difference, right? That's $50 million. And I think $50 million is enough to sway a policy from Congress, right? So I'm just saying there's a lot of money involved to keep this going. And I don't like that. I don't like that. I don't care so much that this is going on. Like, the DGA is basically a business. The Heart Association's a business. They need money to run whatever. But I think people should at least be informed about, kind of the real intentions of what's going on, right? If you still want to hate on saturated fats, be my guest. I don't care. But I think people should at least know what's going on and where these ideas come from and why they're being pushed so much, so that we can make better informed decisions. That's really my end goal here. So I think that's enough talking for me. My mouth's getting really dry. But PUFAs, I'll make a video about that someday. They cause a lot of oxidative stress and damage to your body when you eat them. And so essentially what I'm talking about here specifically with PUFAs are seed oils, which is another thing hammered home in my nutrition classes, that these are essentially healthy. Now, my classes weren't saying to eat these 24/7 by any means, all things in moderation, but soybean, canola, safflower, sunflower, all these crazy oils that you find in literally everything are actually pretty bad for you on literally a cellular level. So I'll do a deep dive on that another day. But if you've made it this far, thanks. That was a lot of talking. Obviously, you don't have to take my word for it. Go do your own research. It doesn't take a lot. This stuff's literally out there. And come to your own conclusion. But I just thought this was some crazy stuff going on, and it's been brought forth to Congress. There's a lot of higher upper people that have tried to bring about some change, and they just are getting ignored. So I think it's crazy. So anyways, thanks as always. Like, comment, let me know what you think, subscribe, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Okay, thanks.